That's my granddaughter up there.
Where is he? I can't see him anywhere. He promised he'd be here. Maya. No. I want to know why he's standing in a hallway.
Diane, does anyone still have Eleanor's letter? It's in the archive. I should have read it years ago.
Grandpa, what didn't you tell me?
Some secrets are too heavy to stay buried.
The morning sun hadn't fully cleared the gymnasium roofline when Walter Briggs unlocked the east doors of Fairview High, same as he had for 31 years. He moved through the empty halls with the quiet economy of a man who knew every creak in the floor by name. Folding chairs, still stacked from Friday's assembly, waited in the gym. Banners reading Class of 2026 hung crooked over the stage. He straightened one without being asked. Today was different, though Walter said nothing about it. Today, Maya graduated. He'd raised her since she was 7, since the accident that took her parents and left her folded into his arms on a hospital bench, asking questions he didn't have answers for. 11 years of packed lunches, of homework at the kitchen table while he ate cold coffee standing up, of him missing her school plays because the boiler needed fixing and nobody else would fix it. 11 years, and today she'd walk across that stage in a white gown, and he intended to stand in the back, just close enough to see her face when they called her name. He was polishing the trophy case glass when Principal Diane Castellano found him. Walter. Her voice had the clipped precision she used for parent complaints and fire drills. A moment. He set down his cloth. "Ma'am, there's been a request." She adjusted her glasses, not meeting his eyes. "From the board. Mr. Ellison specifically. About today's ceremony." Walter waited. He'd learned long ago that silence got people to say what they meant faster than questions did. They feel the ceremony should reflect the school's image. Prominent donors will be photographed. Local press. Mr. Ellison believes. She paused, choosing the coward's phrasing. That staff should observe from outside the main hall today, not inside. The trophies caught the light between them. Walter's granddaughter's name was 3 years running on the honor roll plaque 6 feet to his left. "You're telling me not to watch my granddaughter graduate. I'm telling you the board has asked that non-essential staff remain outside during the ceremony." Diane's jaw tightened. "It's optics, Walter. It's one day." He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she looked away first. "Understood," Walter said, and picked his cloth back up. By 9:40, the gymnasium filled with families in their best clothes. Phones raised, programs fanning against the heat. Richard Ellison stood near the stage in a suit that cost more than Walter made in 2 months, shaking hands with a photographer from the county paper, positioning himself in every frame like a man auditioning for a portrait. Walter stood outside the propped double doors, in the hallway, where he could hear the band tuning but not see the stage. He'd found a folding chair from the janitor's closet and set it against the wall. He didn't sit in it. He stood, hands folded, watching the doorway the way he'd watched hospital corridors 11 years ago, waiting for something he couldn't control to resolve itself. Inside, the ceremony began. Names called, applause rising and falling like tide. Maya Briggs. Walter's chest seized. He stepped toward the door, just to see her walk, just for 3 seconds, and found the doorway blocked by an usher, who'd clearly been given instructions. "Sir, I need you to stay back here. That's my granddaughter." "I understand, sir, but—" He didn't finish, because at that moment, from somewhere inside the gymnasium, a chair scraped hard against the floor, and a voice cut through the applause like a blade. "Where is he?" It was Maya, still in her cap and gown, diploma in hand, standing at the podium microphone she had no business standing at, because she'd walked straight past the principal's outstretched hand and toward it instead, scanning the crowd, then the doorway, then finding her grandfather's shadow through the propped door and locking onto it. Where is? 600 people turned to look at the man in the gray uniform standing in the hallway. Diane Castellano rose halfway from her seat. Richard Ellison's practiced smile froze mid-formation, the photographer's flash catching the exact moment it cracked. "Maya," Diane started, moving toward the podium. No, Maya didn't step back. Her voice, amplified now through the gymnasium speakers, didn't waver. "I want to know why my grandfather, who has worked at this school longer than most of you have been alive, is standing in a hallway while I graduate. I want to know who decided that." Nobody answered. 600 people, and nobody answered. Walter, in the doorway, felt something in his chest crack open that he'd kept sealed for 11 years. Not anger, not quite. Something closer to grief, and something closer to being seen. "Sweetheart," he said quietly, though the room was too large for it to carry. "Sit down. Finish your day." No. Maya's eyes didn't leave the crowd. "Not until someone tells me why." Richard Ellison found his voice first, low enough for those near him to catch, but not low enough. "This is a matter for after the ceremony." "It's a matter for right now," Maya said, "because you're the reason he's standing out there." The gymnasium went silent enough to hear the ceiling fans turning. And in that silence, in the back row, an elderly woman in a floral dress, a retired teacher, 78 years old, present because her grandson was graduating too, rose slowly to her feet. "Diane," she said, loud enough now for Rose to turn. "Does anyone still have Eleanor's letter?" Diane Castellano's face went the color of chalk. The name landed on Diane Castellano like a hand closing around her throat. Eleanor. For a moment she wasn't standing at a podium in front of 600 parents. She was 26 years old again, filing paperwork in a cramped office that smelled like old paper and radiator heat, being handed a sealed envelope by a woman with silver hair and told, "When the time is right, you'll know." She'd tucked it into a drawer in the school archive 15 years ago and told herself she'd deal with it eventually. She never had. Diane, the retired teacher, Mrs. Alcott, Walter registered distantly. She'd taught here decades ago, was still standing, floral dress catching the gymnasium light. "You know exactly what I'm asking." "This isn't the place," Diane said, but her voice had lost its clipped authority. It came out thin. "It's exactly the place." Maya's voice, still amplified, still steady. She turned from the crowd to look directly at Diane. "What letter?" Richard Ellison stepped toward the podium now, hand raised in a gesture meant to smooth things over, the kind of gesture men like him had used their whole lives to end conversations they didn't want to have. "I think we're all getting a bit carried away on an important day for these students." "Don't." Maya didn't even look at him. "You're the one who had him removed. You don't get to tell us to calm down." A murmur moved through the crowd now, parents leaning toward each other, phones no longer capturing smiling graduates, but capturing this, whatever this was becoming. Walter, still framed in the hallway doorway, finally moved. He stepped through, past the usher who no longer had the will to stop him, and walked down the center aisle in his gray uniform, keys swinging softly at his belt, toward his granddaughter. "Maya." His voice was quiet, but the room had gone so silent it reached every corner. "Enough. This is your day. Don't let it become about me. It already is about you," Maya said, and for the first time her voice cracked. "It's been about you for 11 years, and nobody's ever said thank you. Not once. Not the board, not the school. Nobody." Walter's jaw tightened. He reached her, put a steady hand on her shoulder, the same hand that had steadied her at 7 years old on a hospital bench. "I don't need thanks." "I know," Maya whispered, "just for him." That's exactly the problem. Behind them, Mrs. Alcott was still speaking, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone too old to care about consequences. Diane, that letter was meant to be read the day Eleanor's promise came due. I believe that day is today. I believe it has been today for longer than any of us want to admit. What promise? A parent called out from the third row. Richard Ellison's composed mask finally slipped fully. This is absurd. We are not litigating decades-old history at a graduation ceremony. Then when? Richard. Mrs. Alcott turned to him, and something in her tone made the powerful man visibly shrink. You've had 15 years to make sure it was never litigated at all. The accusation hung in the air. Diane Castellano stood frozen at the podium, hands gripping its edges, staring at the sealed drawer in her mind's eye that she'd been avoiding since the day Eleanor Vance had pressed the envelope into her hands and said words Diane had never told a single soul. He will try to disappear, Diane. Promise me you won't let him. She looked out at the gymnasium, at Walter Briggs standing beside his granddaughter, dignified even now, even shrunken by 31 years of being overlooked, and something in her finally broke loose. It's in the archive, Diane said quietly, then louder, forcing it out like a confession. The letter is in the archive. Eleanor Vance left it with me 15 years ago. I should have read it a long time ago. The gymnasium erupted into overlapping voices, questions, gasps, someone asking who Eleanor Vance even was to people under 50. Walter's face had gone very still. Only Maya, standing close enough, saw his hand tighten almost imperceptibly on her shoulder. Walter. Diane's voice found him across the crowd, quiet now, stripped of procedure. Did you know she left something? He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was barely above a whisper, but the microphone Maya still stood beside carried it to every row. I knew she meant to. I told her not to bother. 31 years ago, Walter Briggs was 31 years old when he first walked through the doors of what was then called Vance Preparatory Academy. Not as a janitor, but as a construction foreman overseeing the school's final renovation before it opened its doors to its first working-class students. Eleanor Vance had built the school from her late husband's fortune with a single conviction burned into every blueprint. Education shouldn't belong only to the wealthy. She'd walk the construction site daily in her sensible shoes, asking Walter question after question about load-bearing walls and wiring, the two of them forming an unlikely friendship over shared coffee on overturned crates. You understand this building better than the architect does, she told him once, watching him correct a wiring diagram that would have caused a fire hazard within a year. I just pay attention, ma'am. That's rarer than you'd think. When the school opened, Eleanor asked Walter to stay on as head of maintenance, not out of charity, but because she trusted no one else to keep the building's bones sound. He agreed, thinking it temporary. He stayed 3 decades. What almost nobody knew, what Walter had never once mentioned in 31 years, was that Eleanor Vance had done something else during that first year. She'd quietly used her own funds to cover tuition for a boy who couldn't otherwise have attended, Walter's late brother's son, orphaned young, and living with Walter after a fire took his parents. She'd done it without press, without plaques, without asking Walter to thank her. Families take care of families, she'd said, when he tried. This one's yours. Let me be part of it quietly. The boy, Walter's nephew, raised as close as a son, had graduated Fairview 8 years before Maya. He'd gone on to become a doctor in Ohio, a fact Walter kept folded away like a photograph he looked at only in private. But there was a harder truth beneath even that one. The construction contract Walter had originally signed made him, on paper, a minor equity partner in the land the school sat on, a gesture Eleanor had insisted on when the county nearly seized the lot over a zoning dispute and needed a local landowner's signature to save it. Walter's signature. His name was still, quietly, on a deed buried in a filing cabinet nobody had opened in decades. He had never told anyone. Not because it was a secret exactly, but because the moment he became a man who owned part of the school, he stopped being simply Walter, the man who fixed what was broken. And that was the only version of himself he'd ever wanted to be. When Eleanor grew ill in her final year, she called Walter to her bedside. "I'm going to write it all down," she told him, weak but insistent. "What you did, what I did, who you are to this place. So no one ever mistakes you for replaceable." "Don't," Walter had said, holding her frail hand. "Let me just be the man who keeps the boiler running, Eleanor. That's enough for me." "It was never enough," she whispered. "It just took less from you to believe that." She wrote the letter anyway. She gave it to a young administrator named Diane Castellano, newly hired, with instructions to keep it sealed until the day came that Walter needed protecting, and to trust that she would know that day when it arrived. Then Eleanor Vance died, and the school renamed itself Fairview High, under new leadership eager to modernize, eager to forget the woman who'd built it, on the promise that dignity shouldn't be rationed by class. Richard Ellison's father took over the board. Records were reorganized. The letter sat forgotten in an archive drawer for 15 years, and Walter Briggs kept fixing what was broken, exactly as he'd always wanted, never once telling anyone that his name was on the deed to the ground they stood on, or that the school's own founder had tried, at the very end, to make sure the world saw him. Back in the gymnasium, standing beside his granddaughter, Walter felt all 31 years pressing against his ribs at once. "Walter!" Diane's voice reached him, uncertain now, stripped of every procedural wall she usually hid behind. "Do you know what's in that letter?" "I know what she wanted to put in it," he said quietly. "I asked her not to." "Why?" Maya's question, soft now, aimed only at him. Walter looked at his granddaughter, really looked at her, cap slightly askew, diploma crumpled in her fist from gripping it too hard, and answered the only way he knew how to answer difficult things. "Honestly. Because once people know what you're owed," he said, "they stop seeing what you give freely. I didn't want this school's kindness measured against my name. I wanted to just take care of it, like it was mine to take care of, without needing a deed to prove it." Mrs. Alcott, still standing in the back row, spoke into the quiet that followed. "That's a beautiful way to live, Walter, but it's also how good men get erased." Richard Ellison, sensing the room's sympathy tilting hard against him, made one last attempt at control. "None of this changes today's proceedings. I suggest we—" "Get the letter, Diane," Walter said, cutting him off. The first time in 31 years anyone present had heard him interrupt a person of authority. "Read it." Eleanor waited 15 years. "I think that's long enough." Diane Castellano's hands shook as she unlocked the records room down the east hallway, the gymnasium's noise fading behind her into a low hum. She hadn't been in this room in years, hadn't needed to be, had in fact arranged her entire career around not needing to be. The filing cabinet stood in gray rows, unlabeled to anyone who didn't already know the system. She found the drawer marked Admin, Historical, Vance, her fingers trembling as she pulled it open. The envelope was exactly where she'd placed it 15 years ago. Cream-colored, gone slightly yellow at the edges. Eleanor Vance's handwriting on the front reading simply, "For Walter, when it's time." Diane sat down hard in the dusty office chair, envelope in her lap, and allowed herself, finally, to remember the day she'd been given it. She'd been 26, desperate to prove herself in her first real administrative role, eager to please a board that valued efficiency over sentiment. When Eleanor had handed her the letter with trembling hands and said, "You'll know when the day comes," Diane had nodded and told herself she would. But days became years, and the board changed, and efficiency became the only language anyone around her spoke, and somewhere in that slow erosion, she'd stopped being the kind of person who trusted her own judgment about when. She'd let fear make that decision for her instead. Fear of Ellison's father, and later Ellison himself. Fear of complicating a simple, orderly narrative about a janitor who kept things running and asked for nothing. She broke the seal. Diane, if you're reading this, then either Walter has finally allowed himself to be honored, or something has forced the truth into the light before he was ready. Knowing him, it's likely the second. Walter Briggs is not owed a debt by this school. He is not a footnote to its history. He built its bones, financed a boy's future when I asked him to let me help quietly, and signed his name to save this land when no one else would. Fairview exists because of him as much as because of me, and he has spent every year since making sure no one noticed that fact, because he believes his worth should never be measured in what he's given. I am asking you to correct that belief publicly on whatever day this finally comes due. Not because Walter needs the recognition, he genuinely doesn't want it, but because this school needs to remember what it owes to people who never asked to be owed anything. Read this aloud, Diane. Let everyone hear it. And then let Walter decide, for the first time in his life, whether he wants to keep the story quiet. But let that be his choice, freely made, not a secret kept by cowardice. With gratitude that outlives me, Eleanor Diane sat with the letter for a long moment, tears finally breaking through 15 years of practiced composure. Then she folded it carefully, rose from the chair, and walked back toward the gymnasium, toward a room full of people, a furious board chairman, a girl in a cap and gown, and a man who had spent 31 years trying to disappear into usefulness. In the hallway, Richard Ellison intercepted her, his voice low and urgent. Diane, think very carefully about what you're about to do. If that letter says what I think it says, it complicates the deed. It complicates ownership. It complicates a lie we've been comfortable living inside, Diane said, and for the first time in her career, she didn't wait for his permission. You had years to make this right quietly, Richard. You chose today to make it worse instead. That's on you now, not me. The board will not be pleased. Then the board can be unpleased with the truth, Diane said, and walked past him. She re-entered the gymnasium to find it exactly as she'd left it. Walter and Maya standing together near the podium, 600 people waiting in a silence that had become its own kind of ceremony. She stepped to the microphone, envelope in hand, and looked at Walter directly. "This is yours," she said. "Eleanor asked me to read it aloud, but she also said it should be your choice whether I do." She held his gaze. "Walter, do I read it?" Every eye in the gymnasium turned to the man in the gray uniform. Walter looked at Maya first, at the fierce, unwavering hope on her face, the girl who'd stood at a podium and refused to let him disappear into a hallway. Then he looked at the 600 strangers waiting, and somewhere in that sea of faces, he thought he saw Eleanor's patient, insistent eyes. "Read it," he said quietly. "I think I've hidden long enough." Diane Castellano unfolded the letter with steady hands this time and began to read. Not to a committee, not to a board, but to 600 people who had come expecting only a graduation. She read Eleanor's words exactly as written. The story of a construction foreman who understood buildings better than architects did, who caught a wiring flaw that would have burned the school down within a year, who signed his name to save the land when the county threatened to seize it, who quietly took in his orphaned nephew and let a dying woman fund the boy's education without ever asking for recognition. She read the line, "Fairview exists because of him as much as because of me," and a wave of quiet gasps moved through the crowd like wind through a field. Somewhere in the third row, an older man rose to his feet without being asked. Diane recognized him after a moment. Dr. Marcus Briggs, Walter's nephew, the boy Eleanor had funded, now a physician in his 40s, standing in a gymnasium he hadn't set foot in for over a decade, tears already on his face. Diane read the letter's final lines. Eleanor's request that Walter's story be honored, and her insistence that the choice to stay quiet or step forward always remain his, and then folded the paper closed. The gymnasium didn't erupt into applause right away. Instead, something quieter happened first. Richard Ellison, cornered by 600 witnesses, and a truth he could no longer manage, sat down heavily in his seat, saying nothing. His practiced authority finally, publicly, gone. Then Maya turned to her grandfather, tears streaking down her face, and said the only thing that mattered. You built this place, and you still came to fix my mess every single night for 11 years. You were never a mess, Walter said, voice rough. You were the reason any of it made sense. The applause started slowly, a single pair of hands from Mrs. Alcott in the back row, and then rolled forward through the gymnasium like a tide finally released. 600 people rising to their feet for a man who had spent 3 decades believing his worth lived only in what he could quietly fix. Diane stepped down from the podium and crossed to where Walter stood, extending her hand, not as a principal to an employee, but as one adult finally admitting a debt to another. I'm sorry it took this long, she said. You read it, Walter said simply. That's what matters. Richard Ellison left before the ceremony resumed, slipping out a side door under the weight of 600 stares he'd never anticipated and would not soon forget. The board would meet the following week, though by then the story would already be moving through local news, then regional, then further. Not because Walter sought it, but because Maya, without asking permission, posted a single photo from the ceremony with a caption that read simply, "My grandfather built this school and then spent 31 years pretending he hadn't. Today, we made him stop pretending." The ceremony resumed 20 minutes later. Maya crossed the stage to collect her diploma, and this time, when her name was called, Walter Briggs stood in the front row, invited there by Diane herself, a folding chair set beside the family section with his name taped neatly to the back. He watched his granddaughter's face when they called her name, saw her find him instantly in the crowd, saw the fierce, relieved joy in her eyes. Afterward, as families filtered out into the parking lot, Diane found Walter alone near the trophy case he'd polished that morning, Eleanor's letter still folded in her hand. "The board wants to discuss the deed next week," she said. "What you want to do with it. Whether you want your name formally recognized in the school's history." Walter considered the trophy case, the honor roll plaque with Maya's name on it, the 31 years folded into every hallway he'd ever swept. "I don't need a plaque," he said finally. "But maybe it's time the next kid who feels invisible around here knows somebody built this place who once felt exactly like they do." Diane nodded slowly. "I think Eleanor would like that answer. She usually knew what she was doing," Walter said, the faintest smile finally reaching his tired eyes. Even when it took 15 years to land, he picked up his keys from the trophy case where he'd set them that morning, and walked out into the parking lot to find his granddaughter. No longer a man hiding in a hallway, but a man finally, quietly, seen.
You know, the hardest part of this story isn't the reveal. It's how long Walter was willing to stay invisible. 31 years of showing up. 31 years of fixing what was broken, asking for nothing, and telling no one what he was truly owed. And the only reason the truth ever came out was because one 18-year-old refused to sit down and stay quiet. That's the part worth sitting with. How many people in your own life are quietly holding up more than anyone realizes? How many janitors are actually the reason the whole place still stands? If this story moved you, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like Walter's. Subscribe if you want more cinematic stories about ordinary people carrying extraordinary weight. And drop a comment. Who's the Walter in your life? The one who never asked to be thanked? I read every single one. See you in the next story.